So, Jason, tell us your story and how you got interested into the ancient astronaut theory and ancient civilizations and Zecharia Sitchin's research.
I'd be happy to. I'm currently 36, and when I was 20 years old in college, I attended college in San Diego, California, and someone had just kind of casually mentioned to me that had I seen the face and pyramids on the surface of Mars that had been imaged by NASA. And so as a 20-year-old, not having any knowledge of ufology or just NASA in general, I was like, no, and I don't believe you. And so when someone showed me these photos as a college student, I was very intrigued, and I didn't believe that they were actually from Mars. So I took it upon myself to look through some NASA archive photos, which are freely available on the Internet. But this was back in 1996, and at the time, the Internet wasn't as easy to access as it is today. So it was more of a learning process hobby that allowed me to then access some of these raw images of NASA where they had taken surface imagery of Mars. And sure enough, the pictures did exist. So from there, as a college student, I became very interested. And it turns out that the principal scientist in charge of arming the orbiters and landers we send to Mars with cameras, meaning these, these orbiters and landers have all types of instruments on them. Some of those instrumentation are cameras. And it turns out the principal scientist that does most of the cameras, 90% of them, is a gentleman named Mike Malin. And Malin Space Science Systems just happens to be located in San Diego, where I was attending college. So I called Dr. Mike Malin and said, listen, I'm just a college student, but I see that some of the pictures that your cameras have taken are of pyramids, a face on Mars. What's your feeling on this? Could these possibly be artificial? And Dr. Mike Malin was very nice in explaining that no, in his opinion, these are all natural weather-eroded objects by sand and wind, and there were no intelligent Martians or prehistoric humans that had built these structures. That raised my curiosity even more, Mike, because to me, as a layman, no formal training in this, they looked like a face in pyramids. So I dug.
It does to me too.
Go ahead. Yes.
I was just saying it does look like a face on Mars, and I don't. And same with the Cydonia region on Mars. I don't know how you can deny that it doesn't. It's 3 pyramids, just like it's almost identical to Egypt, and you got a face which is almost exact replica of Egypt. You got the Sphinx, and you got the 3 pyramids. Explain that a little bit.
Exactly, and so really what I decided to look into was further research about this area, Cydonia, where the face and pyramids are located. And I was able to find 5 to 10 peer-level review scientists that had PhD credentials in image analysis and had published data about the Cydonia region. Now, they didn't work at NASA, but they had the same credentials of people that did work at NASA, and the data that they exposed showed, for instance, mathematical algorithms used on Russian satellite telemetry, so that, for instance, orbiters around Earth that are taking pictures of the surface of the Earth, we could, for instance, take pictures of Russia and then use mathematical algorithms to say, those are troops or tanks being hidden by shrubbery or a tarp. So the mathematics would actually expose the fractal patterns as non-linear, and they're, just ways to detect what's possibly artificial and what's not. So using these same mathematical algorithms on the telemetry of the surface of Mars, it turns out Cydonia, the pyramids in the face, 98% probability of artificiality. So NASA never really exposed any type of due diligence in looking at these structures. They just came out and said, there's nothing to see here. So that really raised my interest, Mike, in realizing, like you said, here I'm looking on the surface of Mars, which is another planet, but then I turned my attention to Earth and realizing we have structures all over the Earth here. Nazca, Machu Picchu, Tiwanaku, Giza, Stonehenge, all over the Earth there are megalithic structures that we don't really know where they came from or what their purpose was. So that's really where the focus of my research has gone in the last 10 years, is investigating human origins and understanding where do we come from? What is the first recorded civilization we have on Earth, and how does that fit into our understanding of current modern science? So that's brought up today's current topics of what we'll dive into in this show.
Yeah, and that's what this show is mainly about, which is going to be the Anunnaki, the Sumerian culture, and a little bit about the advanced technology that they had back then. But since we're already talking about Mars, you just explained the Mars and Earth connection, but explain to the audience because there's many out there who don't know much about the Mars-Earth connection, because people were saying, what is the Mars-Earth connection? Okay, there's pyramids on Mars, okay, but explain how there could have once been a civilization on Mars.
Well, there's two ways to answer that. One is with the evidence that we have, and two is with the historical data that we've been able to retrieve from records. So the historical data is that the culture that I focused on, which is the Sumerian culture, modern-day Iraq, heard of called Mesopotamia, Babylon, originally was called Sumer 6,000 years ago. And this is something we'll talk about deeply tonight in the show in the limited time we have, but their references within these ancient texts, which are on stone tablets that go back to 6,000 years, some of these tablets have very accurate astronomical data, and they cite the distance between the outer planets, and they show the color of the planets accurately. Now, we didn't know the planets' color, like Uranus and Pluto and Neptune, some of the outer planets, until the late 70s and early 80s, when we could send Voyager and Galileo to take color photos. The Sumerians had actual stone tablets which described the outer planets accurately. So along with this vast array of astronomical information, some other depictions actually showed people traversing from Earth to Mars as a way station, a mining point where, and we're kind of jumping ahead here, but the Sumerians, this ancient culture from Iraq, had evidence that they lived amongst their living gods. We'll talk about that. They gave a term to these people. They called them Anunnaki, which simply meant those who from heaven come to earth. But just like in the Bible, it says there was once a time when there were giants upon the earth. These texts from ancient Iraq predate all the tales we have in English and are recorded in stone. Many of the same biblical tales are paralleled in these stone tablets. So just to kind of boil it down as a long-winded answer here, the historical data does show that we have visited Mars and have used it in the past. How unbelievable as that sounds, there is the visual data as well as the text written in stone. And then the modern evidence is that, yes, there are photos from orbiters we've been sending, not just from NASA, but also now from the Japanese as well as the European Space Agency, which have confirmed there are structures on the surface of Mars in the Cydonia region, which, in many people's opinion, are artificial structures. A large face over a mile high and over a mile long and 1,500 feet high, carved out of rock, a huge face, and pyramids within the vicinity. And so the connection obviously arises, a question, well, if there's a face and pyramids on Mars, and we have the Sphinx and pyramids in Egypt, maybe there is some type of Mars-Earth connection. And that was actually my first site, mars-earth.com, where I focused in on a lot of this research. So it is a very interesting topic, Mike, but really I think what is intriguing for my research, again, is just trying to figure out on our own planet what's been taking place.
Yeah, exactly. And for people who are just popping into the chat room or just listening to us live right now, we're speaking with Jason Martell. You can go to ancientx.com and also xfacts.com. Go to YouTube or Google videos and just type in Jason Martell, and many things will come up. Many lectures will come up and videos about him. What time frame are we looking at here when the Sumerian civilization flourished, and what time frame did they mention when the Anunnaki came here?
Great question, sure. Well, based upon the historical evidence that we have, the Sumerians have left us some very intricate texts that explain their daily lives and, things that they were doing. And so their culture flourished 4,500 BC, which is roughly around 6,000 years ago. So if you figure 4,000 BC, that's 4,000 years removed from the time of AC to BD. So it's literally 6,000 years ago. At 4,000 BC, we're at 6,000 years ago. And just to give you an idea, if you think about the teachings of the Bible of, BC to AD, you're at the time of Jesus. You go back another 2,000 years, you're at the time of the Hebrew God of Abraham. If you go back another 2,000 years, now you're at the Sumerian epic, and they speak of Anunnaki. And the Sumerian culture is basically where the Tigris and Euphrates merge at the very southern tip of current Iraq, has been called Mesopotamia, Babylon. It's originally named Sumer, and that's what we're talking about here. Now, what happened is in the late 1800s, early 1900s, British archaeologists started to do excavations in Iraq and started to find various types of tablets with text on them, these round, what they called cylinder seals that had reverse carvings on them that, when pressed into clay, would leave a positive imprint. So they found these cylinder seals, the clay with these imprints left from the cylinder seals, as well as many stone tablets with a written language called cuneiform text. Their language consisted of over 400 characters and was written by something that looked like a large, oversized screwdriver called a stylus, and someone called a scribe. Not everyone could read and write, but a scribe had the skill of being able to write cuneiform script. And we think we're cool with our 26-letter alphabet. Right out of the Stone Age, 6,000 years ago, they invent cuneiform script with 400 characters. So what they did is they recorded on these clay tablets, as well as making cylinder seal reverse carved pictograms, and then would rub that into the clay. So now you have pictures as well as text to disseminate through the city, kind of like an ancient printing press. They spoke of their daily lives of, I give you a pound of barley for a donkey. They were the first ones to invent things of systems of courts and law, school, the first system of mathematics as well as writing, which I mentioned, first ones to invent agriculture. They have over 100 of the firsts for a civilization to take place. So the kicker, Mike, is that along with all of their daily events of information, which were recorded in stone, unchanged to this day, they recorded their events of their interaction with their living gods that they lived amongst, and they called these beings the Anunnaki. And that term simply means those who from heaven come to earth. So what we find is a very interesting parallel of texts by these British archaeologists that were removed in the early 1900s, where, for instance, as a specific example, the assistant curator to the British Museum, George Smith, is doing an excavation in a city called Ur, and he pulls out a tablet written in stone, unchanged to this day, which, as he starts to translate it, it's a very old form of an Akkadian derivative, very close to Sumerian cuneiform, but slightly more modern in an Akkadian language, but still in stone, thousands of years before any Hebrew or English version, and it's telling about a Noah's Ark tale, how a Sumerian man, Utnapishtim, is chosen by an Anunnaki to build a large ship because a planet, their home world, is going to be passing by Earth and will cause a large breaking off of the ice sheet and instantly flooding the Earth. And so they said, in a very longer, elaborate tale than we get in Genesis about Noah's Ark, a much more longer, elaborate tale, it's called the Atrihasis, in a Sumerian epic, of how a Sumerian man is chosen by a god to build a craft. So George Smith, the assistant curator, freaks out and goes, "Oh my God, what is this?" and runs out and shows his colleagues. And to this day, it's stored in the British Museum on display as the Flood Tablet. So the Sumerian culture has left us a proliferation of biblical tales that parallel our modern understandings found in the New King James Version as well as the Hebrew Old Testament of the origins of not only Earth, but of humanity. And they give a lot more detailed explanation of what took place, which involved these Anunnaki. I'll pause there.
Exactly, exactly, because and a lot of people, when they look at the Sumerian culture, it's like whatever, like that's all written in stone. We can't understand it or whatever. And people read the Bible, and a lot of people, if they examine history correctly, and just as you have explained, and Zechariah Sitchin, Eric von Daniken, and many others out there, the Old Testament is mostly referring to times of the Sumerian civilization, right?
That's correct.
And
That's correct.
What the capstone of this whole thing, what I find very intriguing, is the tablet with the solar system. And how can a civilization thousands of years ago know all the planets in their particular size, in their particular orbit, and have the sun in the center? Like, if you're denying the Sumerian civilization and their tales and their belief structure and everything that they had to say, then how can you deny a civilization the things that they are telling us through these tablets when they had the solar system on this tablet? It's the defining moment that proves to me that the Sumerian culture is right on.
Well, that is an interesting seal, 35A72, in the British Museum, and actually I think I just gave a NASA frame slide instead of the actual seal. I forgot which exact slide number it is, but I do have that listed on xfacts.com. And yes, that is a very interesting seal, simply because of the fact that many of the tablets that have been left by the Sumerian culture give very accurate astronomical information.
Yeah.
To the degree that the information was recorded by high priests in conjunction with a scribe that could write this information down. And what would happen is that this information was held as sacred, and they would pass it only to the high priests that could interpret the tablet. For instance, on some of these occasions, they would track the stars over hundreds of years and would be able to tell you, for instance, 50 years in advance on what exact day there was going to be a solar or a lunar eclipse. And so they track the movements of the stars very accurately, to the degree that we can now, with our science, verify what they said. And some of it is a little bit out there in the sense that they knew the distance between the planets, the colors of the outer planets, and as you pointed out, they were able to know things, astronomically that you can't know without a telescope. For instance, till the time of Copernicus and Galileo, man thought that Earth was the center of the universe, until we realized, no, we actually orbit the sun. And so on the seal that you pointed out, there's a Sumerian relief that it shows an Anunnaki symbolically handing man the plow as the start of agriculture, but as a backdrop, you see what looks like a rocket ship in the lower portion of the scene that could be on a launch pad, and in the top part of the scene, you see a representation of a solar system with the sun in the center, and all the planets that we currently know of in our solar system listed as their correct size on this stone tablet. So just the fact that the sun's in the center is a very compelling piece of information, that how could they know that the sun was the center and not the earth? So there are many pieces of information on their astronomical scale that lead to further thought about what they say, for instance, about the Anunnaki. They don't just say that these Anunnaki came from heaven. They're very specific. The Anunnaki told the Sumerian that this is where we come from and where we currently go. And it's another planet within our own solar system, which they've labeled Nibiru, which translates into planet of the crossing. And an interesting correlation here is we're talking about beings who the Sumerian, the ancient people of Iraq, worshipped as gods, came from another planet in space, and they symbolize this planet, Nibiru, as a glowing cross. So this is thousands of years before Jesus on the cross, yet we're representing in the sky a glowing cross of where the gods come from. And there are actual Sumerian tablets where you can see a man plowing a field, and it's daylight because there's a bright, shining circle, but next to it, as he's shielding his eyes, he's looking up at the bright, glowing cross, which is also visible by denoted in this scene as the sun being out and also Nibiru being visible. So there are many references that the Sumerian culture has left us about not only their astronomical information, but things we haven't been able to confirm yet with our science, which is beings who visited us from another planet and the specific location of that planet. And that crosses over into some of our modern science for something called the search for Planet X.
We're going to get to Planet X in just a second. But first, explain who the Anunnaki and the Nephilim are. Are they the same, one and the same, or are they totally different?
They are referencing the same group of beings, in my opinion, yes. The Nephilim in the Hebrew Bible means the fallen ones. So the Anunnaki in the Sumerian epic are talking about beings who visit us from heaven and they came to earth. And the Anunnaki actually explain in a very long tale this, I mentioned this text called the Atri Hasis. It's an abbreviated version of a longer text called the Enuma Elish, which explains the Sumerian epic that explains how we came into existence. So the Sumerians worship the Anunnaki as their gods for this reason. The Anunnaki explain that on their own rise to a technological civilization on their planet, Nibiru, they started to mess up the atmosphere and cause devastation to their ozone and such. And they found that by using very fine particulates of gold sprayed into the atmosphere, it helped patch their atmosphere in such a way that they can continue to retain the planet's heat that was needed. So
exactly.
They explain that they found rich deposits of gold here on Earth and decided to come and mine it out of these veins in southern Africa and didn't like doing the mining. They said, this is very hard work, we don't like doing it. And so one of the Anunnaki scientists suggested, let's make a worker race. There's already a pre-hominoid man, an ape-man, Neanderthal, excuse me, that's evolving here naturally on Earth. Let's just put our genetic marker on it, tone it down a bit, and make it our worker race. So, of course, they could have had machines and tools to assist them, but in any type of intricate, mining as an example, you can't just let a machine go and have it do what it needs to be done. It makes more sense that they would have workers to do this work. So, the story explains in this text, that the Sumerians have, that the Anunnaki created the Sumerians in their image and after their likeness, just like the Bible says, and there were a couple of different versions. The first version they made didn't have any sex, and there's an actual tale that explains how they first tried, and it shows a picture, too, of one of the chief scientists. Her name was Ninharsad, and she's holding up what's called the atom. Not atom as in like, hey, how's it going, Adam? Atom as a thing. In Hebrew, Adamu means plural for worker. So she's holding up the first atom as the perfect being. And the tale in this, text accompanying these pictures explains how. And in the picture, I should also note, you see things on the wall like vases and vials, maybe something having to do with in vitro fertilization. So they explain how the first version, the kidney didn't function, the arm didn't work, the leg didn't function, until they finally had a perfect working model. And in this text, you see them holding up a picture on the cylinder seal of the atom, the final perfect working model. And then they called this Lulu Amelu, a primitive worker. Now, they made several revisions until they actually did say, wait a minute, let's give them a sex, the ability to procreate, and then their numbers can increase. So it's a very interesting tale that even the science has confirmed that the mitochondrial Eve, the genetic makeup of the being we call human today that exists, shows up where? In southern Africa 300,000 years ago. And that was on the cover of Time magazine. So very interesting collaboration of the Sumerian epic saying these Anunnaki came here, genetically created a race, us, to their bidding. And another thing is, they created us to mine gold. If you look at our society and how it's based around gold, and how if you were holding a bar of gold in your hand, you'd be like, gold! It's almost genetically programmed into us to really like gold,
Yeah.
So in another point.
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah. Well, just one last.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
It's okay. I talk fast. Another final point about gold is, it's a very good insulator of heat. Now, all the astronauts' visors are lined with gold, so that it's a good reflector of heat. So it's a good logic that they might be using gold to protect their atmosphere when they give that as an example for why they were originally here mining gold to repair their atmosphere.
The only thing I was going to mention was that Michael Tellinger, who I interviewed about a month ago, and other people like Eric von Daniken and a few other researchers out there say that these beings, correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, but these beings, I'm talking about with their research, they explain how these beings came a couple 100,000 years ago and created a slave race which wanted us to mine gold. Like, I'm getting the Sumerian tale confused with their tale.
Well, here, when you say their tale, I'm not familiar with Michael Tellinger off the top of my head, but Eric von Daniken as an example. Here's the difference between Eric von Daniken and Zachariah Sitchin. Eric von Daniken shows a correlation that many cultures have been visited by beings from the heavens. They didn't come from the mountains. They didn't come across the lake or across the ocean. They came from the sky. And he shows many different civilizations have this repeating theme. That's Eric von Daniken. Sitchin, he has one culture, Sumerian. That's it. But it closely is an example of all these other ones that say the exact same thing. Hey, we were visited by people that came from the heavens and gave us knowledge, which we've incorporated into our lifestyle. Some of them do these funny dances around, a circle and wear hats that make them look like an astronaut. Others have a bunch of carvings, and they, worship these carvings as beings that they want to return. The Sumerians have a very intricate realm of information that Sitchin has spent 50 years, that's 50 years of research exposing through his writing that, again, kind of dives very deep into this one culture. So Eric von Daniken gives you kind of a cliff notes of many cultures, whereas Sitchin is just focused in on one. And so I can see how those stories might overlap with the vast array of things that that Eric von Daniken cites.
Are the Anunnaki and the Nephilim benevolent beings?
Well, there's yin and yang, there's good and bad, there's black and white everywhere. And so my answer to that would be that based upon the Sumerian information, they speak of a pantheon of many different Anunnaki, which had members following them. So it wasn't just one Anunnaki who was like the chief and everyone worshipped him. There were different Anunnaki who had rival clans, against each other to have more people follow them. And there were actually at one point a war that took place, and this is why the Anunnaki left, at least in the Sumerian epic tales, is that there was a great war that took place, amongst the Anunnaki, and they eventually left. Now, up till that point, the high priest would work directly with the Anunnaki and receive sacred information, which would then be written down by a scribe. And this is some heavy stuff. Your God is giving you rights and decrees to then disseminate to the people as to how to live their lives. So what happens when the gods leave? Now the priests are like, oh, wait, how do we get our information? What do we do? They start freaking out. And this is where all the idolization began. They built a bunch of statues of the different gods and said, we must worship the image of the god. And to this day, we still carry on that task. So it's a very interesting thing that I'd like to get into some of the specifics now to really raise the eyebrows of your listeners about the Sumerian culture, their understanding. Yeah, so their understanding of the Anunnaki has filtered down into our culture in some very deep ways that, again, it's still used today. So the Sumerians, very specifically with their astronomical system, said they were aware of 12 planets in our solar system. They counted the 9 planets that we know of, plus our sun, our moon, and this additional planet, Nibiru, as the 12th planet, where the Anunnaki come from. And they called Earth the 7th planet. Not the third rock from the sun or the third planet counting from the sun going out, But if you're visiting from outside our solar system and you're coming in, Earth is the seventh planet, sacred number 7, 7 days in a week. So interesting symbology that they would call Earth the seventh planet. Now, the term Nibiru is, again, this planet where the Anunnaki have said to have come from, and they labeled this as the 12th planet. Now, the whole system of knowledge that they implemented around the Sumerians, listen to this, 12th planet. Okay, well, the 12 houses of the zodiac, the division of the heavens into 12 parts, was created by the Sumerians. 12 inches in a foot, 12 hours in a day, 12 in a dozen, all created by the Sumerians. We look at some of the similarities of the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 great Olympians, the 12 disciples of Jesus, all derivatives of the Anunnaki story. So it's a very interesting tale that this number 12 has been symbolized from the Sumerian culture of mathematics, time, calendar, astrology, all of this disseminated from the Anunnaki teaching the Sumerians. Meaning, you ask the Sumerian man, how did you learn all this? They say, everything we know, we were taught by the Anunnaki. So if you visit ancient Iraq, or visit the now what's left of the ancient Iraq Museum, you find a proliferation of texts and tablets which we've been discussing, but as well as very intricate wall carvings and reliefs of what the Anunnaki look like themselves. And I'm not going to say that we look like them or I'm not going to say that they look like us, it's we look like them. Because, again, they created us in their image and after their likeness. But many of the depictions of the Anunnaki are much larger beings, meaning you see Sumerian people and they are depicted as very small, whereas the Anunnaki is a very large being. And people today wonder if the Anunnaki actually were physical giants, maybe 7, 8 feet tall, versus, our standard 6-foot person today. So some very interesting specifics, which, we can discuss more of these, but I think you kind of start to see a pattern here of things coming out of this culture are just a little too many. There's 1, 2 coincidences, okay, 50 coincidences, we have to start to look for an answer.
One thing that I'm getting really mixed up, Jason, because, and it's not just me, it's many other people as well, is the similarity between, or I probably shouldn't even say similarity, but is Nibiru the same planet as Planet X that people are talking about?
In my research, it is, yes. Let me explain those 2 points. So Nibiru, from the Sumerian perspective, is 4 to 8 times the size of Earth and is on a very elliptical orbit that goes once around the sun every 3,600 years. And that's 1 solar year for Nibiru. So we go around the sun, it takes 365 days, that's a year. So 1 trip around the sun is a solar year. Nibiru, the planet where the Anunnaki come from, which is a part of our solar system, it only goes around our sun every 3,600 years. But to them, that's only 1 year. So as an example, why this is an interesting point, is that the Anunnaki do live on Nibiru. They go around the sun once. It's been 3,600 years on Earth each time they visit. So as an example, let's just say Jesus, hypothetically, was an Anunnaki. And he came and visited Earth and said, my people, here are laws and decrees to live by to keep yourself spiritually healthy and physically healthy. And he says, I will return. And he leaves for 3,600 years. And he comes back. He's only aged 1 year. So the whole idea of going to heaven takes a whole different perspective of saying, if you were to go to Nibiru and just stay on Nibiru for a year and you come back, it's been 3,600 years on Earth. Bye-bye, family. So a lot of the information about Nibiru is an interesting part of the Sumerian epic, which they described very accurately, astronomically, with diagrams and depictions and explanations about Nibiru. So that crosses over into today's search, where with our search for extrasolar planets, planets beyond our own solar system that support life, just looking deeper into space, and with our new instrumentation detecting new objects which we didn't even know were out there. And it turns out there's a whole bunch of, let's call them dead worlds or even failed suns, brown dwarfs, that are floating out there that we weren't able to really see until we could fine-tune our telescopes with enough infrared technology to detect these objects. So a whole new thing has happened in astronomical science, Mike, in the sense that most of these solar systems we've been filming out there have two suns. So it started to reason that we probably also have two suns. But where's our second sun? The science says that we probably have a failed sun, which is called a brown dwarf, billions of miles out there, and it also has its own asteroid belt called the Oort cloud. So there's been science over the years to suggest, for instance, why the dinosaurs were killed off was because this other large asteroid belt way out there where our second sun is, there's a large planet, in theory, they called it Nemesis, that orbited that far out sun and would sometimes dislodge debris and comets and asteroids which would come into the inner part of the solar system cyclically over millions of years, and they theorized that possibly was why there was a dinosaur extinction. We look at the outer planets, the moon even, and we see huge impact craters. It looked like it was just bombarded. So that's modern science to suggest that there is possibly another planet within our own solar system, but it's orbiting our failed sun and causes climactic events on a cyclic scale that's millions of years. So the search for Planet X has taken a modern interest where they've started to find planetoids. I call them baby planets. They're nothing. They're little chunks of ice that are, let's say, 800 kilometers wide, 1,000 kilometers wide, nothing 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. So the modern astronomical community has gotten tied up with Planet X because Nibiru was the symbolic planet, and they gave it the number 12. So on the modern side, we only think we have 9 planets. So logically, if we find another one, it becomes 10. That's the Roman numeral X. But it also could mean unknown. So modern science has spun off in this whole direction of, well, if we do find a planet beyond Pluto, it's going to be number 10. So that's where there's become a confusion of Nibiru and the historical data about this planet and gods coming from this planet with now a modern search for a possible another planet in our solar system. And where it gets very interesting, not just a coincidence, Mike, is the data supports the model of Nibiru. In the early 80s, the lead astronomer, Dr. Harrington, produced some research to say, listen, by incorporating one foreign large planet into our solar system model, it explains all the irregularities of why the planets are all being pulled in a certain direction, yet there's no object there. Uranus is tilted on its side. We don't know why. And Pluto and Neptune possibly were moons of Saturn that somehow got dislodged. And so he incorporated a planet, an intruder planet is what he called it, that incorporated into our solar system model explained all the oddities of what was happening in our own solar system. So today, we now have an accepted theory that there's possibly other forces at work within our own solar system, possibly other planets that we are still trying to figure out.
I don't know if this is, I say this is a theory of mine, but I'm sure I've just collaborated off of a bunch of other researchers like yourself, Sitchin, Bodonican. When I explain to people what you just explained, people always say, well, okay, if Nibiru has this 3,600-year orbit, then it must be freezing. Okay, here's what I normally say. Okay, many people will agree that, you know, that there's a Planet X out there because that's actually in the mainstream now, a Planet X. People don't talk much of Nibiru. They talk of Planet X. And there's also many authors that talk, like Jason Rand, who I interviewed, The Return of Planet X, which the book he wrote. And Walter Cruttenden, he wrote the Lost Star of Myth and Time. There's tons of books out there that talk about this star, you know, and just like you called, one of them is the brown dwarf. Okay, that's what we can see visually with our telescopes and Hubble. But what we probably don't see is this little planet orbiting around it. Is that possible that Planet X could be the sun of Nibiru?
No, I believe that it's the issue is not us seeing Nibiru, it's identifying it, because when they take a shot of a certain area of the sky, remember the sky is three-dimensional, so it's not like it's very hard to target the whole space. When they look at these plates, what they call astronomical plates, there's many different new planets in there. It's a matter of identifying new ones that haven't already been seen. And so that's the vast array of new stuff that they're always seeing, and then having to do more mathematical calculations to say, is that a planet far from us, near us, behind the sun, rotating around the sun? And so there's a lot of math that goes into our detection process today that makes it more of a fine-tuned process versus just looking through a telescope. Now, your first reference, many people do get confused for the term Nibiru and Planet X simply because of the fact that there has been a lot of hype around that term Nibiru as possibly what's going to cause Armageddon or the end of the world. And so we hear terms like wormwood, Armageddon, and then people start 2012 and 2003 or the year 2000, the alignment of the planet. A lot of people start to make their own hypotheses and speculate. But just sticking with the data that we have, it is an interesting model to compare what we have historically recorded and to try and verify the veracity of those written texts with modern science, despite modern science's own agenda. Not everybody in the astronomical community or in modern science in general is willing to cross that line in the dirt and say, yes, there are extraterrestrials and I do believe them. Now, we have seen a change in that attitude where just on CNN with Larry King Live the other night, we had Stephen Hawking and a nice panel of people, including Dan Aykroyd, love you, Dan, that were prominently talking about, well, how would the population react if aliens do make contact with us? And do you think they'll make contact with us or we'll make contact with them? And Stephen Hawking, the eminent, scientist, had, some interesting things to say on that topic. And if you look at the proliferation of more academic minds and religious minds becoming vociferous, speaking out about ufology, I see a pattern emerging that maybe within our lifetime something will happen. Just recently the Vatican said space brothers are okay. If you Google Vatican and aliens, the Catholic Church has gone on record nationally, AP Newswire, saying we're okay with aliens. This does not disrupt the ability to still believe in God. So there is a change taking place within our modern understanding of where we come from and our place within the universe. And it is an interesting thing for me that the past, I think, is kind of a guide to what's going to happen in the future. Everything else in nature is cyclic. The seasons, time, weather, why not on a larger scale? So, and we do see that actually astronomically, things like precession, where the degree of our orbit retards just 1 degree every 25,000 years or so. And we have cultures like the Mayans and the Sumerians that were aware of a timetable that took place around a scale at 25,000 years around precession. So there are things that are happening in a cyclic way. So, I think it is a good measure to look at what's happened on the past, how we've responded and reacted to it, to see how we might potentially be armed to, respond to this information in the future. Let me give you another quick example too when you're ready there. But I'll stop for.
Well, I was just going to ask, when is Nibiru due to return, and what may happen once it does return?
Well, that's kind of hard to speculate. The last time it was probably here, based upon research by Zachariah Sitchin and geological evidence, was around the Jewish Exodus. The next time it might be here, I'm not as qualified to give a guess on this as maybe Zachariah Sitchin, and his research, I believe, is 2038, 2054, something like that. It varies depending on how many, if the 3600-year orbit is 3665 or 3602, there could be some variations in the orbit. So that's kind of a hard thing to predict mathematically when Nibiru would return, as well as even more so the variables as to what it's going to do to Earth. So when I see people out there today predicting the return of Planet X and that it's going to cause all this great havoc and we should prepare for doomsday, I immediately close that link because I don't see any relevance at all in connecting some mythical doomsday event to Nibiru or Planet X, where it's such a high level of understanding that we're still trying to figure out all of the variables to the equation rather than just solve it. So it is an interesting piece of information, though, that a lot of people, I think, look towards religion and science and merging those two fields and finding an answer for where we really do come from.
Is it possible that science and religion can merge like peacefully, and is it possible for that to happen?
Well, let me give you some examples of how it's played out in the past and how it will probably take place in the future. We see some of this in modern times as how people have reacted to contact, where, for instance, in World War I, when we flew over remote islands in Australia or parts of southern Africa and landed our prop planes and stepped out, lit up a cigarette, and stepped up to an Aboriginal and held out a voice recorder and recorded his voice, played it back to him, and he was like, they're gods. They just came out of a big sky ship. They have magic flame tools, and they can recapture my voice. And so there's a term called cargo cult, where as the soldiers set up camp, they'd have shipments dropped to them from aircraft, and sometimes these shipments would drop into a tribe instead of the camp, and the tribe cracks it open, and the shipment's like canned goods and weapons, and it's stuff from the gods. So they literally started to worship the planes that brought these items and would scrape away runways and create straw models of the aircraft and worship them, hoping that they would return. Now, they had no knowledge of how the aircraft worked or what it was used for, but in their view, it was godlike. So the same things can be viewed across many cultures around the world, not just the Sumerians, of giving depictions of beings having the power of flight and the primitive man trying to copy or inscribe on walls what he was seeing. And so we have many different cultures doing that exact same thing and saying, look, something dramatic came to us and influenced us, and we've made it now a part of our culture as trying to continue that story on. A primitive man living in a clay hut and using stone tools is not going to say, I was visited by an extraterrestrial in a spaceship. He's simply going to say, it was a god. He doesn't understand technology. So that's the crossover, I think, Mike, of today's research in UFOs is to look at what's happened in the past.
That's very perfectly said, and it kind of leads up to the next question that I had. How far ahead in the future do you see us humans traveling to other planets and creating life and becoming gods to our creation?
Well, that's played out well in popular media and stories like Star Wars and Star Trek. Star Trek, as an example, is a galactic federation of planets, and they have rules where you can't influence, right? They can't go visit some primitive culture and leave their technology behind because that's one of the big rules that they live by. So we see this model played out, Stargate and all these shows. So my answer, Mike, is in my personal opinion, that's already happening. But for whatever reason, the Earth population is being quarantined from that playground. And I think maybe if there was or is a galactic federation of planets, a conglomerate of different races that advise each other and make policies, if they were to look at Earth and see us blowing each other up, expending our natural resources, killing our planet, why would they want to interact with us at all? They probably look at us as we would look at mosquitoes that have just come into the house and are buzzing around. I'm not joking. So
I know
a lot of the research about modern ufology suggests that if you really do your homework, it's real, and it's been happening for a very long time. We've been interacting with many different races, but the public at large, for many reasons, don't need to know this. From simple answers as panic to if you would release advanced technology, you get a backlash of it being used for the wrong purposes. So that stuff is very highly guarded. And I think that for whatever reason, if this is true, we can just expand that thought by saying the reason why we don't see aliens and contact as openly as possibly our ancestors is that the blanket of technology we have in place now to defend our planet is possibly an agreement with aliens that aren't so nice. And I say this because if we look at any of the STS footage, anyone just Googles STS-48, STS-100, STS-72, anything like that, you see some very interesting space shuttle footage of what look like particle beam weapons shooting at stuff in space within our atmosphere. Like literally weapons being discharged from the surface of Earth out into space at objects that then make right-angle turns to avoid these plasma weapons. And this sounds like science fiction, but I'm not making it up. It's all there. So one has to realize, you can either play the ostrich game and stick your head in the sand and say, I don't see anything, or you have to factor in all the evidence. And all the evidence with current ufology says, yes, we have had contact and have had it for a long time, and maybe we're systematically being desensitized through popular media and gradual scientific understanding so that one day when there is contact, people won't freak out as much. You're still going to have to go on with your lives and pay your bills and raise your kids. So I guess time will tell. Here's
I probably should have asked.
Mike, one quick thing I'll throw out there, too, as an analogy. I have a bunch of pets. I have a couple turtles, an iguana, and a bird, and I love my animals. And I feed them, I take care of them. And what connection that they must feel that I'm this large being, and I give them so much love, and I give them everything they need. And even when I'm not home, they know I've got their back. We have nothing like that. We have nothing above humans that we get some sense of, a greater sense of connection, that, wow, I'm not alone. There is something that no matter what has my back. And the ancestors of Earth seem to have had that connection. And, man, I would really like to have that within my lifetime.
Man, you are explaining that so very perfectly. I'm learning something tonight. I never really heard you talk too much on the ET side, like this deeply, like you have been the past couple of minutes. And man, you're a shock to me. But the next question, I probably should have asked this at the beginning of the show, Jason. Do you believe we are being visited today by extraterrestrials, and could these ETs have been, or could these ETs have any connection with the Anunnaki and the Nephilim?
Yes, in my personal opinion, as I just kind of went on that stint there, I very firmly believe, based upon the research and evidence I've seen, we've been visited for thousands of years. They've been influencing us for many years. So, I don't really know how to answer that question other than to say that hopefully within our lifetime, something's going to break this barrier of us not being able to interact with these beings.
So, Jason, tell us your story and how you got interested into the ancient astronaut theory and ancient civilizations and Zecharia Sitchin's research.
I'd be happy to. I'm currently 36, and when I was 20 years old in college, I attended college in San Diego, California, and someone had just kind of casually mentioned to me that had I seen the face and pyramids on the surface of Mars that had been imaged by NASA. And so as a 20-year-old, not having any knowledge of ufology or just NASA in general, I was like, no, and I don't believe you. And so when someone showed me these photos as a college student, I was very intrigued, and I didn't believe that they were actually from Mars. So I took it upon myself to look through some NASA archive photos, which are freely available on the Internet. But this was back in 1996. And at the time, the Internet wasn't as easy to access as it is today. So it was more of a learning process hobby that allowed me to then access some of these raw images of NASA where they had taken surface imagery of Mars. And sure enough, the pictures did exist. So from there, as a college student, I became very interested. And it turns out that the principal scientist in charge of arming the orbiters and landers we send to Mars with cameras, meaning these, these these orbiters and landers have all types of instruments on them. Some of those instrumentation are cameras. And it turns out the principal scientist that does most of the cameras, 90% of them, is a gentleman named Mike Malin. And Malin Space Science Systems just happens to be located in San Diego, where I was attending college. So I called Dr. Mike Malin and said, listen, I'm just a college student, but I see that some of the pictures that your cameras have taken are of pyramids of face on Mars. What's your feeling on this? Could these possibly be artificial? And Dr. Mike Malin was very nice in explaining that no, in his opinion, these are all natural weather-eroded objects by sand and wind, and there were no intelligent Martians or prehistoric humans that had built these structures. That raised my curiosity even more, Mike, because to me, as a layman, no formal training in this, they looked like a face in pyramids. So I thought...
It does to me, too.
Go ahead, yes.
I was just saying it does look like a face on Mars, and I don't. And same with the Cydonia region on Mars. I don't know how you can deny that it doesn't. It's 3 pyramids, just like it's almost identical to Egypt, and you got a face which is almost exact replica of Egypt. You got the Sphinx, and you got the 3 pyramids. Explain that a little bit.
Exactly, and so really what I decided to look into was further research about this area, Cydonia, where the face and pyramids are located. And I was able to find 5 to 10 peer-level review scientists that had PhD credentials in image analysis and had published data about the Cydonia region. Now, they didn't work at NASA, but they had the same credentials of people that did work at NASA, and the data that they exposed showed, for instance, mathematical algorithms used on Russian satellite telemetry, so that, for instance, orbiters around Earth that are taking pictures of the surface of the Earth, we could, for instance, take pictures of Russia and then use mathematical algorithms to say, those are troops or tanks being hidden by shrubbery or a tarp. So the mathematics would actually expose the fractal patterns as non-linear, and they're, just ways to detect what's possibly artificial and what's not. So using these same mathematical algorithms on the telemetry of the surface of Mars, it turns out Cydonia, the pyramids in the face, 98% probability of artificiality. So NASA never really exposed any type of due diligence in looking at these structures. They just came out and said, there's nothing to see here. So that really raised my interest, Mike, in realizing, like you said, here I'm looking on the surface of Mars, which is another planet, but then I turned my attention to Earth and realizing we have structures all over the Earth here. Nazca, Machu Picchu, Tiwanaku, Giza, Stonehenge, all over the Earth there are megalithic structures that we don't really know where they came from or what their purpose was. So that's really where the focus of my research has gone in the last 10 years, is investigating human origins and understanding where do we come from? What is the first recorded civilization we have on Earth, and how does that fit into our understanding of current modern science? So that's brought up the current topics of what we'll dive into in this show.
Yeah, and that's what this show is mainly about, which is going to be the Anunnaki, the Sumerian culture, and a little bit about the advanced technology that they had back then. But since we're already talking about Mars, you just explained the Mars and Earth connection, but explain to the audience, because there's many out there who don't know much about the Mars-Earth connection, because people were saying, what is the Mars-Earth connection? Okay, there's pyramids on Mars, okay, but explain how there could have once been a civilization on Mars.
Well, there's 2 ways to answer that. One is with the evidence that we have, and 2 is with the historical data that we've been able to retrieve from records. So the historical data is that the culture that I focused on, which is the Sumerian culture, modern-day Iraq, heard of called Mesopotamia, Babylon, originally was called Sumer 6,000 years ago. And this is something we'll talk about deeply tonight in the show in the limited time we have, but their references within these ancient texts, which are on stone tablets that go back to 6,000 years. Some of these tablets have very accurate astronomical data, and they cite the distance between the outer planets, and they show the color of the planets accurately. Now, we didn't know the planets' color, like Uranus and Pluto and Neptune, some of the outer planets, until the late 70s and early 80s, when we could send Voyager and Galileo to take color photos. The Sumerians had actual stone tablets which described the outer planets accurately. So along with this vast array of astronomical information, some other depictions actually showed them people traversing from Earth to Mars as a way station, a mining point where, and we're kind of jumping ahead here, but the Sumerians, this ancient culture from Iraq, had evidence that they lived amongst their living gods. We'll talk about that. They gave a term to these people. They called them Anunnaki, which simply meant those who from heaven come to earth. But just like in the Bible, it says there was once a time when there were giants upon the earth. These texts from ancient Iraq predate all the tales we have in English and are recorded in stone. Many of the same biblical tales are paralleled in these stone tablets. So just to kind of boil it down as a long-winded answer here, the historical data does show that we have visited Mars and have used it in the past. How unbelievable as that sounds, there is the visual data as well as the text written in stone. And then the modern evidence is that, yes, there are photos from orbiters we've been sending, not just from NASA, but also now from the Japanese as well as the European Space Agency, which have confirmed there are structures on the surface of Mars in the Cydonia region, which, in many people's opinion, are artificial structures. A large face over a mile high and over a mile long and 1,500 feet high, carved out of rock, a huge face, and pyramids within the vicinity. And so the connection obviously arises, a question, well, if there's a face and pyramids on Mars, and we have the Sphinx and pyramids in Egypt, maybe there is some type of Mars-Earth connection. And that was actually my first site, mars-earth.com, where I focused in on a lot of this research. So it is a very interesting topic, Mike, but really I think what is intriguing for my research, again, is just trying to figure out on our own planet what's been taking place.
Yeah, exactly. And for people who are just popping into the chat room or just listening to us live right now, we're speaking with Jason Martell. You can go to ancientx.com and also xfacts.com. Go to YouTube or Google videos and just type in Jason Martell, and many things will come up. Many lectures will come up and videos about him. What time frame are we looking at here when the Sumerian civilization flourished, and what time frame did they mention when the Anunnaki came here?
Great question. Sure. Well, based upon the historical evidence that we have, the Sumerians have left us